You are listening to The Culture, a podcast on race and politics.
The Culture.
On this episode, I want to look at the Department of Corrections through the eyes of Chasman Barnes. Chasman was a childhood prodigy, a gifted orator from his youth, a skilled pianist, played piano as a church musician on Sundays, almost every prominent Black church in Orlando at one point or another. All of this while he was in high school. Listen to this brief account of Chasman's experience in the Department of Corrections custody.
I'm Chasman Barnes, a native of Eatonville, Florida, and I spent almost 20 years of incarceration in the Florida Department of Corrections. My story is long, my journey arduous, but I'll begin here. I'll take you back to when I was 19, 20 years old, waiting for a sentencing for a crime I didn't commit, waiting on the decision of a judge to decide what ultimately would be my future. While waiting in the Orange County jail, I witnessed some of the atrocities that take place on a daily basis among incarcerated men and women. From violence to a lack of security, to apathy from guards and administrators, to deplorable living conditions like mattresses that are torn up, sheets that have been used so much that they are thin and frail, rodents running, scurrying about, grabbing the next Cheeto that they can find, roaches, rats, vermin, you name it. On top of that, inmates who are in the very same position that I am in, either having been adjudicated guilty and awaiting sentencing, or being shuffled through as another name and number through a justice system that ultimately they won't find justice in. In the midst of their experience, there's all kinds of stress and distress, which leads to violence, to depression, to outbursts of various kinds, and sometimes even bloodshed. There are things that I have seen and witnessed that I would rarely ever want to talk about or speak of, because ultimately you may lose your lunch. But the fact of the matter remains is these things happen all the time, and our system desperately needs to change. Things I've seen like two men at each other's throats over something as simple as a fork. Men fighting over what seems to be garbage, but it was actually a meal served in a jail. Two men may come fist to cuffs over something as simple as a bag of chips that one feels is owed to the other. Not only are the conditions poor, but ultimately the inmates who are incarcerated there tend to be poor as well, whether it's from the socioeconomic status that they come from or just not having the support from friends, families, loved ones while incarcerated. This was the beginning of my story. And even after having been sentenced to 23 years in the Department of Corrections for a crime I didn't commit, I found myself as a 20-year-old young man getting off of a long, gray, dismal Bluebird bus with rusted wire throughout it, handcuffs on my wrists, shackles on my ankles, being herded in the very first prison I've ever seen in my life. Needless to say, I was afraid. Didn't know what I would face, didn't know what I would endure, didn't know if I would even make it out, alive. Some of the things that I've seen as an incarcerated man would blow your mind, but I'll share just a few of them here. Things like violence from, by, and through correctional officers. What I'm about to say may shock you. It may even offend you. I hope it does, to the point that you'd want to make a difference. Truth be told, they are ultimately responsible for a huge amount of violence that takes place in our Florida prisons. I've seen men, and by men I do mean correctional officers, conjure up violence between inmates, then turn around and use that very violence as an excuse to abuse those inmates. I've watched officers restrain inmates with handcuffs and or shackles and still mace them after they've been subdued, still kick them, beat them, and stump them after having been restrained. When the inmate is clearly no threat, has given up, no longer fighting, would still kick, stump, and abuse that man while he is yet on the ground. I've seen women, and by women I mean female correctional officers, use their bodies, use their femininity, use their wiles or what they think are charms to pit inmates one against the other. I've watched them lie. I've watched them look men dead in the face, including myself, and say, "I will lie on you," in order to manipulate them into doing what they themselves would never want to do on their own. That's just the first few months in my incarcerated experience. After all, you do understand that being sentenced to prison is the punishment. They are not to be punished beyond the prison. Just being there is the punishment. By law, they're not to be punished further for the so-called crime that they have been committed. The incarceration itself is the judgment. However, I've watched on many occasions authorities, officers, administrators, and staff alike go above and beyond to so-called punish, hurt, harm, or teach a lesson to an incarcerated man or a woman in our system. These are some of the serious atrocities that I've seen in the Florida Department of Corrections. But I thank God that I survived all of them. How? By the grace of God, by an unapologetic faith in Jesus Christ, by sometimes keeping my head down, at other times keeping my mouth shut, at other times keeping my eyes and ears open. Most of all, throughout my experience, I didn't wear my heart on my sleeve, but I kept it open, pliable, touchable, and reachable. To God, through God, for God. Lord, even if the very correctional officers that abuse, hurt, or despise, you would use them as a vessel for change for me. I'm open to your will. I realize that not everyone has that mentality. Not everyone thinks the same way. Not everyone shares the same faith that I hold. But I'm grateful today that I am a survivor because it was God who saw me through. I say to you as a viewer, and I say to those who have family members who are incarcerated, those who are directly impacted, those who may be returning citizens, that is, you who are formerly convicted men and women, you made it too, by the grace of God. Thank you.
I'm not here to defend Chasman's guilt or innocence. Chasman's story makes me think about our ideals as a society, especially when it comes to those we incarcerate. Do we really believe in redemption? Rehabilitation and educational programs in the Department of Corrections are woefully inadequate. Conditions in these facilities are less than desirable. And this is not to take anything away from the many selfless employees at the Department of Corrections that do their job every day with honor and dignity and with not enough pay. Now, I've recently called for more decisive action against the spread of the coronavirus pandemic in our prisons, but to no avail. My overall point is this: if we aren't actively working to change the lives of those who have made mistakes, what are we really trying to accomplish? Our current criminal justice system can't sustain itself the way it is, neither fiscally or morally. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for listening to The Culture. To lend your views on this topic or other issues of interest to you, please go to randolphbracy.com or follow @Randolph Bracy on all platforms.
The culture.